Shalom and greetings, saints of the Most High, Jehovah, our Elohim. I'm Rod Thomas, and I'd like to welcome you to another installment of the Messianic Torah Observer. And I want to thank you so much for taking the time from your busy schedules to fellowship with me here today. And as always, it is my hope, trust, and prayer that this installment of the Messianic Torah Observer finds you, your families, and fellowships well and blessed. And I want you to know that this program is hosted on our website at www.themessianictorahobserver.org. And there you'll find the social media platforms we utilize, the various methods by which you can contact us, as well as the platforms by which you can support this ministry with your financial gifts. So let us hear from you. And without further ado, let's get right into today's discussion entitled The Book of Romans, What It Is and What It Is Not. This is part 15 of our Paul and Hebrew Roots series. And if you've been following me for any length of time, you may recall that I began a series entitled Paul and Hebrew Roots in the fall of 2018. And with the completion of my discussion on Paul's view of women leaders in the faith in September of 2019, that was part 14 of the series, I put the series on somewhat of a hiatus, fully intending, however, to resume the series in short order. And you may also recall that I embarked on this series because I had received so many inquiries about certain challenging and difficult Pauline passages that seem to oppose the Hebraic Messianic Notsari lifestyle or Torah keeping by Yah's set-apart people. However, while I was a few episodes into the series, questions regarding Paul's view of women in Messianic and church leadership roles caused me to shift the course of the series. So I veered away from a general discussion of Paul's difficult and challenging writings for a detailed study of Paul's true view of women in the Messianic faith. Well, today we will resume the series as promised and get back on our original intended course. And needless to say, we have a lot of ground to cover for the duration of this series. So my focus in this series will now turn to Shaul's or Paul's Sefer, the book, the letter, the epistle or scroll to the Romans. And over the next several installments of this series, we will identify, we will dissect, and we will attempt to accurately interpret, that is, explain some of the more challenging and unclear passages of Romans. Regarding those pesky, challenging, and unclear Pauline writings that we've all come to love and hate, the Apostle Kepha, or Peter, wrote in his general epistle, "And account that the long-suffering of our Lord is salvation, even as our beloved brother Paul also, according to the wisdom given unto him, hath written unto you, as also in all his epistles, speaking in them these things." And what are those things that Peter is referring to? That which was formerly written by the set-apart prophets and the commandment of Yehoshua and the end times. He lines this up in chapter 3, verse 2. But he's continuing on, in which are some things hard to understand, which they that are unlearned and unstable wrest, as they do also the other scriptures, unto their own destruction. And that was 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 15 and 16, the King James Version rendering. So even Shaul's apostolic colleague, Peter, recognized contemporaneously that Shaul's readers might have some difficulties understanding some of the things Shaul wrote, which tells us that Kiva himself had to have read some of Shaul's writings and thought to himself, what in the world is he talking about? But let us remember, and I mentioned this in my portrait of Shaul, the man and the apostle. It was like the first couple episodes of the Paul and Hebrew Roots series, that Shaul was indeed a unique, a complex, a brilliant servant of Yahweh, Yahuwah. And he obviously was operating on a different plane than his apostolic colleagues at the time. But just because some of Shaul's writings are a bit challenging and difficult to understand doesn't mean we can't, with a little spiritual and mental elbow grease, accurately understand them. Why are we doing this? Why are we doing this series? Well, we're doing this for a few reasons, some of which I went into great detail when we first launched this Paul and Hebrew Roots series. And if by chance you are either new to this program or were not able to listen to any of the segments to this series, I would humbly encourage you to do so when you get the chance. And I'll go ahead and put the link to this show's index page in the show notes, where you can select whichever installment of the series you want to listen to for your convenience. But suffice to say, one of the greatest points of division that exists between the Hebrew Roots, Messianic, Notsari community and our cousins in fundamental traditional charismatic Christianity are doctrinal and theological teachings that are based upon a scandalous misinterpretation or misrepresentation of Shaul, of Paul's writings. And let's not mince words here. We're talking primarily about areas of Paul's writings where Paul addresses issues and topics related specifically to Torah keeping, to Torah keeping by Messianics, by Christians, if you will. Now, we're going to look at a great number of interesting and challenging Roman passages covering a whole host of topics and issues, not just his pesky and confusing passages on Torah. And the ultimate goals of this series are, 1, to help us better understand various aspects of our set-apart walk with Messiah that were uniquely revealed to the apostle to the Gentiles by our Master Yehoshua Messiah, and 2, to help correct and or dispel some of the confusion that surrounds some of Paul's challenging and or more difficult passages. I have to say to you that I am very excited to be taking this journey with you. I really am. And the reason I'm so excited about resuming this series is simply that much of what most of us know of the book of the first century Roman Messianics, it's from a Christian, Trinitarian, grace only, pre-tribulation, secret rapture, dare I say anti-Semitic, replacement theology perspective. So with all the advancements our faith community has made in our understanding of the Hebrew culture, our understanding of Hebrew history, of geography and language, it seems about time we stop embracing the worn-out, tired old westernized brand of Pauline Christianity that we've been told to accept and begin tapping into the insights of a true Messianic Torah observer who was uniquely selected by Yeshua Messiah to be an apostle, that is a sent one, to the Gentile peoples of the first century world. To get this party started, so to speak, I've elected to begin with the book of Romans. Now, as it relates to our study of Romans, we are going to conduct more of a topic or issue study than a chapter by chapter, verse by verse study of the book. Therefore, we will only examine those passages that present unique challenges to our faith community and or that highlight unique aspects to our Messianic set-apart lifestyle. Let us not forget that the series title remains Paul and Hebrew Roots. So we will only be interested in discussing those topics and issues contained in Romans that present particular challenges and insight into important aspects of our faith. So let's get started by setting the tone for our study. To begin with, no Torah observant disciple of Yeshua Messiah should pick up the book of Romans or any other Pauline epistle and simply start reading it without first coming to terms with what it is he or she is actually reading. For I can tell you, and you should inherently know this already, that Romans is not like the books of Torah, nor like the books of the prophets, nor like the writings such as Psalms and Proverbs, nor like the gospel records. Romans and Paul's other letters are simply ancient letters, written by an ancient writer, addressed to a specific ancient reader or readers, written in response to topics or issues, or I should say, and or issues that came to the ancient author's attention, plain and simple. And we will see that contrary to what most Christian scholars and teachers and preachers contend, Romans is not a theological framework upon which to establish and maintain a church organization. You see, if the set-apart truth seeker truly desires to arrive at an accurate understanding of what Shaul is putting forth in his letter to the Roman assembly of Messianic believers, he or she must first gain as much information about Paul, such as who the man is and who the apostle is, and I covered this in the early stages of this series. He or she must gain as much information about the identity and or identities, if you will, of the epistle's intended audience, such as the Romans. Who were they? And gain an understanding of the situation on the ground in Rome that prompted Shaul to pen his letter in the first place. The only way for the Messianic truth seeker to gain a true understanding of those challenging and difficult Roman passages is to reject, is to fight against biblical laziness. What I mean by this is that he or she must learn to appreciate the art of digging deep. Bottom line, biblical illiteracy must be overcome in our lives at all costs. Allow me to explain. Take a sip of Java here. You see, many of us in this set-apart faith can't stand having to reference or read other scriptural passages and verses that are not our specific focus passages or verses. And many of us only want to stick to the focus passage or verse and then be told what these focus passages and verses mean. Biblical laziness. But such an attitude should not get in the way of our search for truth. For as a Torah observant disciple of Yeshua Messiah, we are required to dig deep. Recall that it was our master Yeshua who taught the two disciples on the road to Emmaus of himself through what means? What means? Well, Luke tells us. And beginning with Moses, or Moshe, and all the prophets, he, speaking of Yeshua, interpreted to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. Let me read that portion of where the rubber meets the road, so to speak. Beginning with Moshe, Moses, and all the prophets. He interpreted to them all the scriptures. In all the scriptures, the things concerning himself. And that's Luke chapter 24, verse 27. So our master used the whole of scripture to teach his disciples about himself. And then we have the example of Shaul delivering the gospel to the Bereans, who before accepting the apostles' teachings, they did their homework before. Listen, received the word with all eagerness, examining the scriptures daily to see if these things, that is, the words, the teachings of Shaul, were so. Acts chapter 17, verse 11. Thus, we have to somehow get beyond our biblical laziness and search the whole of scriptures if we intend to take our learning to the next level. So our study will be at times scripture intensive. Just want you to know. And this leads me to what I call the 5 elements that lead to true biblical understanding. You see, when we attempt to read passages from not just Romans, but all the other 65 books of our Bible, the authorized Bible, in what I like to call scriptural sound bites, what I mean by scriptural sound bites, isolated passages by themselves, verses by themselves, without taking into account at least some of these elements, well, we stand the high risk of misinterpreting or misunderstanding that passage. Why would I say such a thing? Well, I say this because Romans and the other books of the Bible are ancient documents from a foreign, ancient culture and people that are totally unfamiliar to most of us today. And these documents are in most cases missing a great amount of background information that modern readers must somehow attempt to grab hold of and understand if they are to truly understand what the authors are trying to convey or were trying to convey to their original audience. So the 5 elements that lead to biblical understanding are these. Number 1, context. Context. Context is that linkage that involves the chapter itself, the book itself, the book where that passage is found, the testament in which that book is found, and the whole Bible. So you can see you have your focus passage. Where does that passage link to other passages maybe in the same chapter? Where does that passage link to other books in that testament? Where does that passage link to the whole of the Bible? Context. We have to take things in context if we want to really understand what it is we're reading. Number 2, history. That is the specific history of the writer and his audience. What were they about? Number 3, language. That is being able to understand specifics related to the Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic words used by the author. Now, let me just say this about studying and taking Greek and Hebrew, and why I believe we don't necessarily need to become Greek and Hebrew scholars or even knowledgeable of Greek and Hebrew, because people have already done the work for us. You know, if you feel led by the Spirit to study Koine Greek, which is the New Testament Greek, which the New Testament books were written in, or Hebrew, and you got to discern whether it's Israeli, modern day Israeli Hebrew versus biblical Hebrew, because you can get caught up in the middle of that and there could be some problems. But if you're so led to do that, that's between you and Father. But bear in mind, when you do that, and you do that outside of Father's will, you need to make sure you recognize how much time it's going to take to do that, and the commitment it's going to take to really become proficient. And that amount of time that you're spending in studying and becoming proficient in Hebrew or Greek, well, you have to ask yourself, could I use that time to become proficient in my studies that are in English? Which, by the way, we have buku amounts of resources that we can tap today online, a great deal of it for free. And we don't need to be Hebrew and Greek experts. It's already written out for us. It's already been researched for us. It's already been interpreted for us. So there's really no true reason to do so, again, unless the Spirit leads you to do so. And if the Spirit leads you to do so, be obedient. I'm not saying, quench the Spirit. You've got to follow the Spirit's leading. But for our general purposes, and for my purposes, I thought often of taking Hebrew classes, but I'm like, wait a minute, I'd rather take that time, the countless hours of learning Hebrew, and actually learn the scriptures. So that's just my take on it, and I'll leave it at that. Number four in our list of 5 elements, geography. Geography, not always pertinent, mind you, but sometimes relevant when travel and locations are referenced in our focus passages. And number 5, culture. And when I'm talking about culture, I'm talking about specific culture of the writer and his audience. Okay? And I'm sorry to inform you that we, modern day Messianics or Christian alike, we're not Shaul's intended audience, despite doctrinal and theological teachings to the contrary. We happen to be beneficiaries of the information that Shaul passed on to his Roman Messianic assembly readers. Like anything else, when it comes to Bible study, the information we come across, which was not originally addressed to us, we being 21st century Messianics, must always be understood from the perspective of the writer and his original readers. We have to take that step. We have to somehow get out of this erroneous mindset that Paul's writings were written to 21st century Christians and Messianics. Now, inherently, we know that it wasn't written to 21st century Messianics, but we delude ourselves by thinking that I can read this ancient document as if I'm reading a June, let's say, what is today's date? As if I am reading a April 30th, 2020 magazine, Popular Mechanics magazine, Field and Stream magazine, or any kind of other book that we get off of Amazon that we feel we can just read it and understand it, and we don't have to take into account the 5 elements I just spoke of. We can just understand it by just reading it. And especially when you factor in reading some of the versions like the King James Version, even the Sefer Bible, which to me just kills me that it's still written in Elizabethan English, but they put in the Hebrew names. But anyway, I've already done my review of Sefer and other episodes. But when you factor in these really, really difficult and archaic translations of the Bible, man, there's no way you can really accurately understand what you're reading unless you're able to factor in these elements that I just spoke of, the 5 elements that I just spoke of. What were they again? Context, history, language, geography, and culture. These all have to be factored in, even in the book of Romans. So we have to get this erroneous mindset that the book of Romans and all of the other Pauline writings were written to us here in the 21st century. They weren't. But we are blessed that these documents, through the grace of Yah, were saved and passed down to us over the centuries. And we benefit from these ancient letters because contained within them is the words of Yahweh, Yahuwah, and the teachings of Yeshua, our Mashiach, our Messiah. And this is the mindset we will maintain throughout our study of the book of Romans. Unfortunately, many church leaders, and not too few Messianics, treat the letter to the Romans as some sort of theological treatise and not what it truly is. What do I mean by theological treatise? Well, a theological treatise is simply a formal document that identifies, presents the facts, and puts forth a conclusion on a specific issue or topic to its reader. And the conventional thinking by many in the so-called church is that Paul decided one day to sit down and write out his thoughts on various and sundry Christian-related issues, and then send those thoughts on over to the Roman assemblies for their reading and reference. In fact, many see the book of Romans as some form of Christian living manual. Thus, according to such individuals, any well-intended believer who seeks to live a sound Christian life would be compelled to go to the book of Romans and any other Pauline writing to learn about topics and issues that are common to Pauline Christianity. And although there is a slight degree of truth to all this understanding of the book of Romans that some people have, the truth of the matter is that it is not a theological treatise. Romans is in fact a letter written by the Apostle Paul specifically to first century AD Roman Messianic believers. And this letter addresses certain relevant contemporaneous issues and topics that are specific to the first century Roman Messianic assemblies. You see, since beginning this series in 2018, I've come to a clear understanding that Shaul was a cause and effects kind of guy. You see, something or some things happen, that something or some things comes to Shaul's attention, and then Shaul responds by addressing that something or some things in the form of a letter. So apart from the book of the Hebrews, which is in a sense a theological treatise that many scholars attribute to Paul, none of Paul's epistles are theological treatises. You see, Shaul wrote as he was moved to do so, moved by the Holy Spirit to respond to ongoing or contemporaneous issues that were adversely affecting the assemblies he oversaw. Now, none of this is to say that Shaul does not use the opportunities afforded him in his various epistles to expound upon theological matters, because clearly he does so on a frequent basis. But his writings are in response to the specific issues and topics that his Roman Messianic readers were experiencing. Thus, Romans, as in all of the remaining Pauline epistles, must be viewed as an ancient historical document first and foremost. However, I would take this statement one step further, if you please. Romans is an ancient historical document that contains essential spiritual truths. At this point in our discussion, I'm reminded of a sermon that I heard a couple years ago where the speaker made a common but terribly flawed statement about the book of 1 Timothy. The speaker said that 1 Timothy was specifically written as a church organization manual. And in his making such an error-ridden statement, the speaker and his denominational organization effectively robbed Shaul, robbed Peter, and those of us hearing the speaker's message of the original purpose for which 1 Timothy was written. And it should be recognized that this speaker's error in referring to 1 Timothy as a church manual effectively shut down the main point of his sermon. And that point was that the church's members are entirely subject to the teachings and directions of her leaders. How convenient. As it relates to the historical nature of Romans, Douglas J. Moo, New Testament professor at Wheaton College, in his article entitled The Epistle to the Romans, and this is found in the New International Commentary on the New Testament, Dr. Moo wrote, like every book in the New Testament, Romans is rooted in history. It is not a systematic theology, but a letter written in specific circumstances and with specific purposes. And to understand its message aright, we must appreciate the specific context out of which Romans was written, end quote. Well, I think this is a good place to stop for now. Surprise! And we will pick this study up in our next installment of the Messianic Torah Observer, Abba willing. In our next post, though, we will examine who the book of Romans was addressed to, for there are some essential facts as it relates to Paul's Roman audience that every Messianic who studies Romans must be cognizant of if he or she is to truly understand what Shaul was trying to convey to his Roman Messianic readers. And of course, at any time during this series you have a specific passage of Romans that you want to discuss, or you have questions about the content in which I'm discussing at any given time, just shoot me a message using any of the contact platforms we have available on our website, themessianictorahobserver.org. You know what? Let me just give you our email address. Just in case you may be driving, or you're busy doing some housework, or you're busy working, however, whatever you may be doing, so that you can keep this in your mind and shoot me that email. It's perceptionwp@gmail.com. Again, that's perceptionwp@gmail.com. Otherwise, we're going to simply go through the book of Romans in chapter sequence. So, until next time, may you be most blessed, fellow saints in training. I'm Rod Thomas, signing out. Shalom. Take care.